From the vast menagerie of mythology arise a multitude of fantastic beasts from all corners of culture that persist today in defiance of their fading points of origin. Many creatures have captured human imagination in a way that has allowed them to far outlive the cultures that instated them, and very few are better recognized than the great hellhound Cerberus. A triple-headed amalgamation of nightmarish creatures, Cerberus guarded the gates of Hades, the Greco-Roman underworld that, in modern times, we tend to equate with the Christian concept of hell. A more accurate summarization is that it was the universal receptacle of the dead, a place for the morally good as well as the wicked. All dead souls found their final resting place beyond the gates of Hades. None were permitted to leave, and Cerberus saw to that. Classical depictions of Cerberus are overwhelmingly analogous. In other words, many sources agree on what his defining characteristics are. Typically, he is established as a gargantuan dog with 3 or more heads borne upon an infernal body that ends in a tail of potentially serpentine qualities. Since dogs are associated with the steadfast loyalty and obedience that make for trustworthy sentinels, Cerberus's status as a guardian is symbolically obvious. Meanwhile, his multiple heads and reptilian properties serve to associate him with the Hydra, also said to have been a guardian to the entrance of the underworld, as well as the Golden Fleece in more modern times. By extension of such a resemblance, Cerberus also falls under association with the archetypal treasure-hoarding dragons of casual folklore. The connection proves stronger still when considering that the archetypal dragon has been symbolically drafted in Christian ideology as a representation of Satan, Hell's chief resident. Snakes integrate naturally by virtue of Cerberus's affinity for dragonkind, a notion that is ultimately unified under Satan's transformation into the snake responsible for man's expulsion from paradise. The covert movements of a serpent keeping low to the ground further lends foundation to an archetype that has evolved to symbolize unforeseen danger, lurking within unknown territory. Another cryptic concept to consider here is the Ouroboros, the snake that epitomizes life and death in a cyclical process by consuming its own tail. Cerberus is known for guarding the border between the living and the dead, and is therefore reminiscent of related ideas. The Latin word for Cerberus, like many Roman words, is borrowed from Greek. This word, Kerberos, is purportedly cognate, that is, linguistically connected, with the Sanskrit word Karbara, or Sabala, one meaning of which is spot, or spotted. Whether or not this is actually where the name Cerberus originated from is a topic of debate. Sanskrit is a language widely seen as a predecessor of the Indo-European language family, and so it isn't surprising that it would have influences on Greek. The meaning of Karbara in particular would appear to have many interesting incarnations, with varying connotations. When referenced in a Sanskrit dictionary, the word Karbara alone can mean anything from spotted to multicolored to sin to demon. It is even used as an epithet for the deity Durga, a goddess presiding over destructive war, likely in reference to the stripes of the tiger she is often depicted with. Most of these imply something inauspicious. Even the word spotted itself, though seemingly innocuous at first, can have unsettling associations in Hinduism. For example, in chapter 34 of the Shiva Purana, a group of divine gods known as Devas witness various bad omens, one of them being a spotted sun. Another connection between Cerberus and Karbara emerges from the guard dogs owned by Yama, the Hindu god of death. Often depicted riding a blue buffalo, Yama is equipped with a noose that he uses to capture souls, while his guard dogs are said to assist him by bringing additional souls and holding them captive in the underworld, Naraka. This is undeniably very similar to Cerberus's function, but it becomes especially interesting when considering that one of Yama's dogs is named Sabala, meaning the spotted one. Nevertheless, it's been reported that linguists largely doubt that the origin of Cerberus's name lies in Sanskrit and Hinduism. More modern theories suggest that the name is possibly related to the Proto-Turkic Karaboru, meaning black wolfhound, or possibly a Phoenician root meaning hound of the earth. Others still are content to claim that Kerberos comes from the Greek word karbaros, which means something along the lines of having a heavy head, which would potentially make a lot of sense, given Cerberus's monstrous, multi-headed qualities. This word is possibly associated with another monster, the Catoblepas, a beast originating from Ethiopia that is said to resemble a Cape buffalo, and is well known for having a heavy head that it keeps low to the ground. Returning to the notion of Karbara and Hinduism, it's worth reiterating that Yama's mount is just as well a buffalo, but the already muddied etymological history of Kerberos makes it difficult to argue that these are in any way related. All things considered, Cerberus's potential heavy-headedness is perhaps best explained in Marus Servius Honoratus's commentary on the Aeneid of Virgil, wherein he equates Cerberus to the earth, since it is ultimately the consumer of corpses. Given that bones do not break down as easily as flesh does, Cerberus would constantly have his heads low to the ground as he gnawed them to pieces. While Cerberus is usually depicted with 3 heads, some characterized him as having 50 or more, possibly to display his eternal function as the all-seeing guardian of the entrance to Hades. 3 is likely the most consistent truncation of Cerberus's head count because symbolically, the concept of the number 3 is incredibly charged. Time especially is typically divided into units of 3, past, present, future, birth, life, death, beginning, middle, end. These are all familiar triplets. A so-called magic number, the popular rule of 3, is a ubiquitous cultural phenomenon. It is everywhere. The Greeks saw it as the most perfect of all numbers, and developed countless logical theories around it. In China, it is a number associated with luck and the divine. In Japan, 3-toed dragons are envoys of balance, freedom, and good fortune to come. The symbol of the third eye, in Hinduism, the eye of consciousness, or the inner eye, represents a state of clairvoyance and enlightenment. And groups of 3 show up constantly in Christianity especially, where numerology is of great symbolic importance. There is the Holy Trinity, the 3 gifts from the wise men, and the ascension of Christ on the 3rd day after his crucifixion, during which he died at 3 p.m., and these are only a few examples out of many. With these examples in mind, the majority of instances where the number 3 proves to be of great symbolic significance have to do with time, luck, and knowledge. So it is not unlikely that Cerberus's typical 3-headedness has something to do with the stages of human life and the realized fortunes therein, divided into 3 segments. This has symbolic common ground with the 3 Moirai sisters, as well as with the triple-faced goddess of the underworld's crossroads, Hecate. Greco-Roman mythology has no shortage of multi-headed entities. It was said that Cerberus had a double-headed brother, Orthrus, an arguably lesser version of Cerberus himself. While Cerberus was entrusted with the souls of the dead, Orthrus guarded the red cattle of Geryon the giant, a job that he ultimately died failing to fulfill, when Hercules arrived to seize them as part of his 12 labors. For the sake of reference, the worst that Cerberus ever endured at the hands of Hercules was when Hercules carried him out of the underworld and exposed him to the sun. This being the case, It's clear that Orthrus was not intended to embody the concepts befitting of an immortal guard dog such as Cerberus, in spite of their similarities. Hercules also disposed of Geryon, who, interestingly enough, happened to have 3 heads himself. The fact that Orthrus's master was triple-headed only emphasizes Orthrus's status as an incomplete rendition of Cerberus, a microcosm of his infernal brother that perhaps exists in order to draw attention to Cerberus's importance and competence by comparison. Orthrus's name means something along the lines of morning twilight, and because of this, it is probably related to the star Sirius, whose celestial path was thought to be responsible for midsummer droughts. The brightest star in the night sky, Sirius is also known as the dogstar, and was considered a portent of evil that foretold desiccation, disease, and heat. Consequently, it was also associated with Hecate, and therefore aspects of the underworld. One of Hecate's jurisdictions as an underworld goddess involved spirits of the dead, which dogs were certainly associated with, given their tendencies to scavenge near dead bodies. It was even said that the Greek philosopher Pythagoras would bring a dog into the vicinity of a recently deceased person in order to receive their departing spirit. To the earliest Egyptians, Sirius was thought to be the home of departed souls, and thus may have served as the foundation upon which Anubis, the Egyptian god of the afterlife and guide of lost souls, was constructed, just as Orthrus and Sirius are arguably lesser versions of Cerberus. Cerberus is arguably a lesser version of Anubis, who is a more humanized representative of the concept of death, in spite of retaining the animalistic traits that allude to his feral origins. It's very likely that Anubis, who predates Cerberus, influenced the nature of Cerberus's mythology. But it doesn't help that the Greeks did not care much for therianthropic, that is, animal-headed gods. In fact, any time you have a god in Greek mythology taking on the form of an animal, it's usually in pursuit of more sinister purposes, such as kidnapping maidens or inflicting divine retribution. The gods were not perfect beings after all, and the Greeks needed ways to express this. And Hellenistic creatures that combined both human and animal traits were almost always monsters. If the idea of Cerberus does indeed originate from Anubis, this might explain why the Greeks did not opt to keep Anubis's more humanized aspects, while the original concept of Cerberus likely depicted him as merely a watchdog. Anubis may have inevitably contributed more sophisticated notions regarding life and death to the Cerberus archetype. Both are attendants of the underworld, and they share an epitomic form in this regard. Anubis shepherds souls in his funerary barge across the Nile, a river known as the symbolic expanse between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Cerberus prowls the banks of the Styx, a river likewise thought to be responsible for separating the living from the dead, as he prevents departed spirits from leaving. The Egyptians and the Greeks have had an abundance of influence on one another historically, resulting in Cerberus appearing as a multicultural icon. One of the more prominent examples of this involves a Greco-Egyptian composite god by the name of Serapis, whose name originates from Userhapi, or Osiris Apis. The most credible depiction of Serapis is a statue of a Pluto or Hades-like figure, enthroned with a grain basket symbol known as a modius. This was because the yearly harvest was considered symbolic of life being sustained through the act of death, as the season transitioned into winter. With a scepter in its hand, the statue also featured the likeness of Cerberus at its feet, complete with a serpentine uraeus etched into the base, an Egyptian symbol denoting rulership that also happens to revisit the connection between snakes and the underworld. There are sources claiming that Cerberus was eventually dismissed by Hades and granted freedom for his loyalty to the gods. In the wake of this, he apparently adopted a more refined, modern incarnation that first emerged in the Ars Goetia grimoire under the alias of Naberius. This transition likely occurred around the 16th century, a time frame wherein Greek mythology was not nearly as relevant as it had been some 2,400 years earlier. As the demon Naberius, he adopts faculties spanning beyond the unadulterated animal savagery befitting of a guard dog. A newfound aptitude for rhetoric in particular is made obvious by the few and brief descriptions provided contextually alongside him. Though the triple-headed hellhound anatomy typical to Cerberus's classical design is retained, the advent of Naberius renders him in association with two novel motifs, the crow and the crane. The symbolism lent by these two birds is immediately involved with Cerberus's newfound affinity for rhetoric. Flight and feathers harness the power of the wind, which can be a representation of breath, or, in other words, speech. So it is reasonable to assume that the blue crane, an animal with a shrill cry and dark plumage, applies particularly well when placed alongside the cawing of a crow or the barking of hellhounds. Naberius is therefore a more human-like Cerberus, an evolved guardian overseeing the school of cryptic rhetoric, who may act as a patron to orators. Cerberus exists today as a motif that is generally well known within our modernized mental collective. The persistence of Cerberus as a mainstream icon runs parallel to the domestication of wild animals, a pursuit that can be symbolically interpreted as man's ambition to tame and integrate otherwise feral aspects about himself. Canine domestication is as ancient as it is unchanged. Guard dogs today maintain the very roles to have been bestowed upon them at the dawning of mankind. They are among the most commonplace of household animals, occupying familiar urban hideaways just as intimately as our subconscious minds. Thus, the image of Cerberus prospers vigorously within the human psyche, sustained by constant encounters with what are very often our own pet dogs. There are numerous examples of how the notion of Cerberus lives on even now. Video games, ever in need of adversaries to challenge players, are mediums rich with references to Cerberus, and mythology as a whole. One particularly interesting modern portrayal of Cerberus can be witnessed in the 2010 adaptation of Dante's Inferno. But before we get into that, there are a few things to know about the original poem. So, in the original Dante's Inferno, Cerberus is mentioned briefly, and he's meant to establish an image of literal gluttony, so as to set up a transition into more metaphorical depictions, which is why avarice, essentially gluttony of the mind, follows this circle. Appearing in Canto 6, Cerberus is apparently a thunderous, three-headed monster, described as having an oily beard, a large belly, and clawed hands that he uses to flay and quarter the gluttons stuck in the muddy sleet that endlessly rains down from the sky. A beast representing irrational appetite, Cerberus is rendered docile in his haste to devour clumps of mud thrown into his gaping maw by Dante's guide, Virgil. Dante's inspiration for Cerberus's role and treatment in gluttony likely comes from the Aeneid, where Cerberus is again described as a loud and terrifying beast, until Aeneas's guide, the Sibyl, feeds him a spiked honey cake that immediately sedates him. Cerberus is referred to as Il Gran Uomo, or the Great Worm. An alternative translation mentions his dragon jaws yawed wide, the word yawed meaning to twist or to oscillate. Both examples further strengthen the link between Cerberus and dragonkind. The word worm in English derives from the Old Norse orm and Anglo-Saxon werm, collectively meaning anything from an actual earthworm to a snake, a serpent, a dragon, and so on. The distinction made by using the word worm as opposed to a word more connotative of an actual serpent may be to draw attention to detritus, a substance of decay eaten by common earthworms. The word worm, therefore, implies something that is especially chthonic, something deep under the earth, that is likely associated with death, descriptions coinciding quite comfortably with Dante's sludge-eating Cerberus. While the rhetoric used in the poem renders Cerberus's features somewhat ambiguous, the concept art and in-game aesthetics for Dante's Inferno replicate Dante's original Cerberus quite closely. Instead of guarding the mouth of hell, this Cerberus resides within the confines of a literal mouth, from which his heads emerge as though part of a three-forked tongue. The serpentine shape, meat-hued color, and slimy texture of Cerberus's three necks evokes the word worm in almost every way. Like the original, this Cerberus is bearded. Each head features what appear to be slick tufts of hair, and though originally described as having blood-red eyes, this Cerberus would appear to have pale eyes, a pair on the main body, and perhaps, since they share the same textures, along the neck as well. The white, clouded-over color suggests that they are blind, as if to inspire the notion of one's judgment being blinded in the wake of excessive desire. The pair of eyes on the main body especially, in addition to the nose, are proportionally smaller compared to Cerberus's hands and mouths. Another interesting detail worth noting is that the ring of snake-like mouths surrounding each head more closely resembles Cerberus's portrayal in the Aeneid, where he is described as having a collar of snakes. His unreasonable appetite is characterized in several ways, such as eating sludge out of his own hands to replenish his stock of projectiles. The cutscene introducing his boss fight also happens to feature the middle head making a snapping motion towards an adjacent head, an action that very obviously underscores destructive hunger, while also vaguely bringing to mind again the concept of the Ouroboros and its association with Cerberus. Cerberus in this incarnation is less a guard dog and more comparable to the likes of an insatiable, treasure-hoarding dragon. Dante's hell is an unpleasant place, but it is traversed in order to gain insight and knowledge, such is the treasure that Cerberus guards, and he does so by challenging one to find a way to bring peace to an entity that is loud and volatile. Gluttony is a very loud place after all. The rain pelts the earth harshly enough to sound like drumfire. Cerberus himself is so loud that the gluttons he oversees would sooner wish to be deaf than to hear him bark. That being said, an interesting trend in Cerberus's mythology is that any time a hero wishes to subdue him, they do not attempt to slay him. Rather, they silence him. Virgil silences Cerberus by enticing the beast to fill his mouth with sludge. One of the 12 tasks of Hercules involved retrieving Cerberus, and he did this by grabbing all 3 of his throats at once, so that he could no longer bark. In Orpheus's case, he is able to lull Cerberus to sleep with his lyre, and as mentioned before, the Sibyl in the Aeneid successfully pacifies Cerberus using a drugged honey cake. There are many other examples of Cerberus appearing as a minor figure across video game franchises, most notably from the role-playing genre. As a reoccurring demon in the Shin Megami Tensei series, Cerberus is allotted several supporting functions throughout the games. In the original Shin Megami Tensei, he can be fused from the protagonist's loyal dog, Pascal, resulting in a unit that potentially far outlevels the player. While normally impossible under ordinary circumstances, Cerberus remains loyal, given his history with the protagonist as Pascal. Later on in the game, he is rendered hostile by the poison of Echidna, and will only rejoin the player if a golden apple is on hand, a scenario that is reminiscent of the pacifying honeycakes he is fed in the Aeneid. Additionally, in Kyoyaku Megami Tensei, Cerberus stays behind when the protagonist leaves Hell in the storyline, insisting that he must prevent the dead from escaping. In Devil May Cry 3, Cerberus appears as a boss, primarily associated with ice. This may be an allusion to a passage of the Divine Comedy that describes the rain in gluttony as icy slush. Cerberus reappears in Devil May Cry 5 as the gatekeeping boss, King Cerberus. Implied to be the progenitor of all other Cerberus demons, he controls the elemental attributes fire and lightning in addition to ice, 3 modes to coincide with 3 heads. He guards the demonic Qliphoth tree, known to bear a fruit every several thousand years after it has been sufficiently nourished by the condensed blood of its victims. Those who eat the fruit of this tree, which grows backwards from the surface to deep underground, are said to gain immense power. This parallels the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Christianity, the fruit of which is said to give power through knowledge, but not without mortality as a consequence. As stated before, Cerberus is associated with snakes, and therefore can be potentially recognized as an extension of Satan, depending on the scenario. His status as the guardian of the demonic Qliphoth tree in Devil May Cry can thus be interpreted as an inversion of Satan persuading Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. While having 2 or more versions of Cerberus in one franchise may at first seem contrary to mythology, it is not necessarily unusual. Many games feature Cerberus as a common enemy, with multiple variants that commonly attack the player in swarms. Cerberus as an enemy with overwhelm and conquer mechanics is something that is likely inspired by 2 things. One being that dogs are by nature pack animals, prone to hunting in groups, and the other being the mythological Cerberus's omnipresent ambience on account of his multiple heads. The Resident Evil series is one such example of a game that uses a dog-like Cerberus enemy to this effect. Resident Evil 7 also features a puzzle that involves collecting 3 keys, each in the likeness of a dog's head. Collecting each head, all of which differ in both shape and color, is a required task early on in the game. Recalling that one of the symbolic themes generally attributed to the number 3 has to do with time, it is interesting to note that the white dog head is acquired from a clock. The blue dog head is found inside a book, which, one could say, fulfills the knowledge aspect of the archetypal number 3. Finally, the red dog head, which demands the most complex approach, is within the depths of the manor's subterranean slaughterhouse, descending into which is akin to passing into an underworld of sorts. One of the most bizarre inclusions of Cerberus comes from New Blood Interactive's ULTRAKILL, a gory, fast-paced first-person shooter about a post-apocalyptic world where blood-powered, biomechanical beings reign supreme. With sources of energy running low, the player must permeate the layers of a Dante-style hell in order to seek out replenishment. The gate to hell, complete with an inscription from the original Dante's Inferno, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," is attended by a pair of seemingly inert stone statues, both of which come to be referred to as none other than Cerberus, guardian of hell. ULTRAKILL's Cerberi are not modeled after the mythological prototype. They are in fact very humanoid, and lack beast-like traits. That being said, They may only bear the title of Cerberus because of the name's potential to be synonymous with gatekeeper. It's also worth mentioning that the game is still unfinished, so it is entirely possible that contextual information may currently be missing. In any case, it is an interesting design choice to associate such a name with. The modern Cerberus has been entrusted with the very same ideals that made him such a prominent figure in antiquated mythology. The animals that serve as his base components reflect human nature on a symbolic level. They become equal to ourselves by means of the relatable attributes they embody, subjective as well as universal. And we, in turn, become them as our most intimate ideals are projected upon the foundational archetypes we perceive within their existence. Cerberus is important when it comes to understanding knowledge, both good and evil, for he is just as much a protective guardian as he is a terrifying monster. The dualistic nature of his occupation serves to teach us that mankind will always accommodate shadowy features on a subconscious level, a proverbial underworld native to the innermost mind that might be represented in association with primal animals and their natural instincts, but also that such crude aspects of humanity can be redeemed and uplifted as superlative forms capable of committing to worthwhile purposes. Just as Cerberus serves the gods, we serve our own personal beliefs, because whatever that might entail, it is the essence of what we believe to be important that drives us to accomplish the goals we set for ourselves. Personal success lies in acquiring the knowledge necessary to pacify that which we come to recognize as our adversary. So long as mankind lives to fulfill a purpose, no matter what this may end up manifesting as, Cerberus will continue to persist and evolve within the collective unconscious that exists in tandem with the human mind.
He's a dog in a canoe. Anubis!
I cannot put this in.